Our keynote speaker this evening, Dr. Kay Stice. Dr. Stice joined the Marriott School faculty in 1998 as a professor of accountancy. He earned bachelor and master degrees in accounting from BYU and a doctorate degree in the same field from Cornell University. Prior to BYU, Dr. Stice taught at the University of Arizona, Rice University, China Europe International Business School, and Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He has been recognized for his instructional success, having received numerous awards and accolades, most notably the prestigious Carl G. Mazur Excellence in Teaching Award, which he received in September. Commenting on the award, an administrator observed that Dr. Stice engages the mind and heart of students. Add to that incredible wit and a sense of the comedy of life, and year after year we have students say he is one of the best teachers they've ever had. Please join me in welcoming tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Kay Stice.
I'm an accounting professor, so we're going to talk about some numbers, and specifically I'm going to talk about the motivating power of measurement. So let's get going. Bounded rationality. The term bounded rationality is used to designate rational choice that takes into account the cognitive limitations of both knowledge and cognitive capacity. Translated, that means, first of all, we don't know everything. And even those things that we do know, we can't fully process those things. So let me give you an example. Is it going to snow at Sundance 2 weeks from today? Well, to properly answer that question, what we need to know is what's the surface temperature of water out in the Pacific right now? What's the subsurface temperature? What are the temperature differentials? What are the wind currents now? What's the ice coverage up to the north of us? And all kinds of other variables. But even if we knew the values of all those variables, we still don't have a model that we could put that into that would then tell us, yeah, it's going to snow or not going to snow. We're boundedly rational. Therefore, what we have to do is take a few variables and apply them in a simple model and then forecast the weather. I looked online this morning, weather.com, is it going to snow at Sundance 2 weeks from today? Here's what it said. 2 weeks from today, the average high is 51 degrees and the average low is 30 degrees. That's as close as we're going to get to forecasting the weather 2 weeks from today. We're boundedly rational. Now, who said this? This came from Herbert Simon. Back in 1957, he won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1978. Well, I've kind of, here's a quote that takes this a level a little deeper. I'll talk about my two loves, statistics and accounting. My father was a statistician, and I teach accounting, so here they are, both together on one page. The objective of the fields of statistics and accounting is to reflect the essence of a complex situation in one number. Now, what great thought genius thought this up? Well, this is me. I thought this up in my office the other day. But let me illustrate. One number, 727. That's your credit score. That one number summarizes a very complex situation. How much money you make, how much money you spend, the strength of the relationship between the spouse couple, if this is a family we're talking about, what your parents taught you about being thrifty, it all comes together in that one number, 727, your credit score. Or 23. That's the current national ranking of BYU's women's basketball team. They're ranked number 23 in the nation. That reflects the recruiting by the coach, the hard work of the players in practice, the fact that we're now in the West Coast Conference. There are a whole bunch of very complicated factors that are summarized in that one number, 23. Or 279. That's the page in the Book of Mormon that I finished reading today, and I'll tell you more about that. But that summarizes a very complex personal study plan that I have, and it's summarized for me on a little piece of paper, which I'm going to explain to you in a bit, but I'll get it out now. This is my personal study plan, in which I can summarize in that one number, 279. That's what statistics and accounting are about, taking complexity and summarizing it into one number. So let me tell you the answer to a question that you've always wondered. Who or what rules the world? Well, reality doesn't dictate policy and what we do. It's perception, how we perceive the world. Well, Accounting determines perception, therefore accounting rules the world. So you were just wondering who's really running this thing? It's the accountants, because we determine how you perceive things by those one numbers that we report. So here's what I'm going to talk about. This motivating power of measurement in 5 different areas. In society in general, in business, in sports, let's make sure we get that in there, in personal finances and in day-to-day personal goals. Let's start with society in general. And again, the point is, how do numbers motivate or summarize or affect our perception of the world? In history, some of you may be familiar with this phrase, 54-40 or fight. This comes from the 1840s. The 54-40 is 54 degrees, 40 minutes north latitude. It's a measurement. And it represents what some people in the United States in the 1840s thought should be our northern border in what was then called the Oregon country. 54-40 actually comes up right up against what was then called Russian America. We now call it Alaska. But we were in a border dispute with Great Britain. We were in a lot of border disputes in the 1840s. We were also having a border dispute with Mexico, and it turns out the very land that we're standing on right now was part of that dispute. But some people summarize this whole issue about the Oregon country boundary in this simple phrase, 54-40 or fight. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and the parallel now is at the 49th parallel, and that's where it is. But that whole complex issue of the relations between the United States and the home country, Great Britain, and the fact that this would have been our 3rd war in just 60 years, and the negotiations and the fishing rights and all those things were summarized for people in a number, 54-40. Here's another one from World War II. You are aware that in the early part of World War II in Europe, it was Great Britain against everybody. And the only way that the British had of striking German soil was with big bomber raids. So on an average night, a bomber raid was about 400 planes. But it was realized by RAF Bomber Command that there would be great propaganda value if we could send 1,000 plane raid to bomb Germany. Propaganda in a positive way to raise the spirits of the British people, but propaganda in a negative way to strike fear into the hearts of the Germans. So they scraped together every plane they could lay their hands on so that they could then announce in the news the next day, we sent a 1,000 raid plane, a 1,000 plane raid, and it bombed Cologne last night. Now they had to get every plane they could lay their hands on. They got instructional planes, and they got flight instructors and trainee pilots, but they got the 1,000, the power of that number. Announce it in the news the next day. We raided Germany with 980 planes. Okay, whatever. 1,000 planes. The number tells you something. When I was a kid in 1965, Walter Cronkite, that was the news we watched, CBS, once a week, and as I remember it was on Friday, but that I'm not sure about. Once a week he would come, and with respect to the Vietnam War, he would say how many Americans were killed that week. It was usually about 20 or 30. Then he would say how many South Vietnamese soldiers were killed that week, and it was usually about 60 or 80, as I remember. And then how many North Vietnamese soldiers, and it was usually 150 or 200. And I remember as a kid, I was 9 years old. Those numbers, I watched them every week. I'm ashamed to say it now, but it was like a sporting contest, and I felt like we're winning. Only 20 of our guys were killed, and 150 or 200 of their guys were killed. This was called the body count by the military officials in Vietnam, and it was an attempt to frame the conflict to show that we were winning. Well, one thing that eventually unraveled in 1968, a few years later, these numbers went up by a factor of 10, so that it was 200 or 300 Americans being killed each week, and the scoreboard didn't look so good. This whole complicated thing of Vietnam and their fight for independence with the French and the domino theory and the fight against communism, all that complexity was summarized by Walter Cronkite every week in my living room in those 3 numbers and the relative magnitudes of those 3. Numbers are very important in establishing our perception. Now, current events. It's been dry until the last week or so, but as of January 31st, one number could summarize how dry it's been in Utah. The water year, if you take the state average as a whole, 68% of normal. So there are a bunch of complex things, and snowfall and snowpack and this and that. one number, 68%. That really tells you all you need to know. That summarizes this complex situation. We may be having a discussion about taxes over the next few months. Is Mitt Romney's tax rate 15% or is it 45%? The numbers just came out a couple of weeks ago, and a simple calculation suggests it's 15%. Mitt is trying to convince people to look at it a little bit more deeply, and there's double taxation at the corporate level, and maybe the real tax rate is 45%. Maybe he'll be able to convince us if he becomes the nominee, but it's going to come down to one of these two numbers, and a very complex issue about U.S. tax policy and how much the rich pay and how much the poor pay is going to be summarized in one of these two numbers. Is it 15% or 45% that Mitt Romney pays in taxes? Speaking of numbers and Mitt Romney, what was the vote count in the Iowa caucuses? If you pay attention to these things, which I do, these first set of numbers show that Mitt Romney won the Iowa caucuses by 8 votes. 8 votes, essentially it's a tie. This summarizes a whole bunch of Iowans sitting around a whole bunch of rooms talking and finally casting their ballots. And it was really a tie between Rick Santorum and Mitt Romney, but since Mitt Romney came out with 8 more votes, he won. And the momentum was rolling as he won there, and then he won in New Hampshire as the first Republican candidate to ever do that. But then they've had to verify the votes, and it turns out that 8 precincts had either lost or thrown away their ballots, so they couldn't be verified. So we had the verified count shows that Mitt Romney actually lost by 34 votes. And I don't know if you noticed it, but the momentum subtly changed. Why? Because of the reality? No, the reality was set weeks before when those Iowans gathered together in their rooms. Very complex discussions. But the simplicity of just adding up those votes and getting the number and who won and who lost, it doesn't matter by how many votes, that affects our perception. President Obama's budget came out last week. And you can tell where people stand on a President Obama based on which one of these two numbers they cite. If they cite the one in red, that the deficit is down to $901 billion, they're in favor of President Obama, and he's lowered the deficit by $400 billion. Those people typically wouldn't then mention that this deficit is twice as high as any other deficit before President Obama's presidency. They're emphasizing the fact that the deficit is projected to go down. Others would say, well, go down from what? It's $1.3 trillion. That's what it is this year. And the deficits that President Obama have run up have been more than everybody else in the history of the country, all added into one. Now, how big is President Obama's budget proposal? It's hundreds of pages, very complex. And yet we summarize it in one of these two numbers. Accounting and statistics take very complex things and summarize them in one numbers because we can't really comprehend the complexity, but we can get a sense of something from one number. And you can see, and this is a point that I'll mention a little later, this creates a system very subject to abuse because by the choice of what you choose to emphasize, which data you choose to emphasize, you can color people's perceptions. I don't even want to talk about this picture. Go to the Congressional Budget Office. And you can see, there's a lot of U.S. history in this picture right here. But a picture's worth 1,000 words, so I'm going to save us about 5 minutes. So let's just go to the next one. Because we get to talk about accounting net income. Now, I have to tell you a secret that some of you don't know. Accounting net income is not a firm, sharp number. Accounting net income is a pretty fuzzy number. I'll give you an example. Let's say that we run a business, and it's based in this building, and this building cost us $30 million, and it's going to last 30 years until we wear it out. Well, that means that as we compute our profit for the year, what we have to do is we have to estimate how much of this building we used up during the year. Because we know we bought it for $30 million, and we know it's going to last somewhere around 30 years, so we're going to use up about $1 million worth of this building per year. And we have to put that as a cost, a business expense, in the computation of our income. Well, that 30 years is not a precise number. What if it was only 15 years? Then the cost per year is $2 million. What if it was 60 years? Then the cost per year is $500,000. Accountants make those assumptions. Is this building going to last 30 years, 20 years, 40? And it impacts the reported numbers. Well, because those numbers can be impacted, people manage these numbers. They carefully manage the reported income of General Electric or IBM or Microsoft. An accounting professor from the University of Washington generated this picture a few years ago. This is one of my favorite pictures, and I'm sure it will become one of yours. What he did is a very simple thing, and the best studies are very simple. He just took a whole bunch of companies reported incomes in the United States for a whole bunch of years. He standardized them so he could put them on the same chart. And he said, let's just put them in, let's just plot them. And you see, it's not quite a bell-shaped curve. It's skewed a little bit to the left here. But what's most interesting is this. Take a look at this right here. You see that line? What you've got is you've got a little bit of a hole here and a little bit of a lump there. Well, that happens to be at the 0 point. What that tells us is if a company computes their income and it looks like it's going to be a little less than 0, minus $100,000. I'm a billion-dollar company, but it looks like my earnings are going to be minus $100,000. I go back to the books and say, are there any assumptions that we can make? Is that building maybe going to last 35 years instead of 30 years? Let's do whatever we can to get ourselves just above 0. We don't want to report a loss. Because when people read the news, they won't really read the complexity of the numbers and think of the complexity of our business situation. They'll say they had a loss. And that's all they'll remember. So what we see here is an abnormally large number of companies with earnings just above 0 and an abnormally large number of companies with earnings just below 0. In fact, whenever I look at this picture, what I want to do is talk to these people. What were you thinking? The ones who looked at the numbers, they came out just below 0 and they said, well, that's the way it is. I mean, didn't you guys go to school? Don't you know how to do this? We've had an example of this same phenomenon just a couple of weeks ago. Facebook, as you may know, is going public, is going to become a publicly traded corporation where you and I and anybody else in the world can be owners of Facebook. I don't suggest that you do it, but you can do it in just a couple of months. Well, as part of that process, according to U.S. law, they have to, for the first time ever, release their financial results to the public. They're online right now at the SEC's website, and here they are. And I don't want you to even think about what all the numbers are. I just want to point you to this one right here. That's their income for 2011. It's $1.000 billion. There's been a lot of talk about Facebook. Are they really a company? Are they really making money? Are they really a billion-dollar company? Are they really going to be worth $100 billion when they go public? The last thing they wanted to do was announce their first earnings and say, we're a $935 million company, or we're a $987 million company. They sat around a table, much like these tables that you're sitting around right now, and said, we got to do whatever we got to do. We got to make whatever assumptions we need to make so that when that number is reported, it's at least $1 billion. And they're thumbing their noses at us a little bit to make it come out to be exactly $1 billion. But the point is this, that number colors our impression of Facebook. They are a billion-dollar company, and they've got the numbers to prove it. In business, numbers affect our perception. And we also see that they affect what we report. Some of you have experienced this in your personal lives, where people are reporting data to you, and if you put pressure on them to report a certain level of data, you can tell that maybe they've biased the results a little bit, as Facebook may have done right here. Now, let's talk about sports, the thresholds. I've just pulled out a few. In baseball, baseball is a great game for a statistician because the game itself is pretty slow. But everything that happens on the field can be turned into a statistic, and so there's lots of time to think about these statistics. So people who like baseball like numbers a lot. So if you're a 300 hitter, that's a big deal. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. If you're a 298 hitter, nobody thinks you're a very good hitter. But if you're a 300 hitter, and to tell the difference between a 300 hitter and a 298 hitter, you'd sit there and watch them play all year long, and the 300 hitter maybe would get one more hit in 6 months. So there's no way that you could actually observe that and understand that. But when you look at the number, you say, well, 300 is great, 298 is not that good. If you're a pitcher and you have 20 wins or more, you're a great pitcher. You're an all-star pitcher. If you want to get in the Hall of Fame, you better have 3,000 hits or 500 home runs or win 300 games in your entire career. These numbers color how people view baseball players. Basketball is a triple-double. You score in double digits, you get 10 or more rebounds and 10 or more assists. And that summarizes a game. A basketball game is a very complicated thing, and lots of things go one way or another, but you can summarize a game. Hey, LeBron James played last night and he had a triple-double. Okay, you don't need to tell me any more than that. I know he had a good game. I know he performed well. This kid Jeremy Lin, who's playing in New York now, he might actually get a quadruple double here one of these days. He's going to get in double digits in points, double digits in rebounds, maybe double digits in assists, and double digits in turnovers. So he's going to get a quadruple double. He's excited. In football, if you're running back, there are two kinds of running backs, those who have run for 1,000 yards in a season and those who haven't. There's a fellow named Dave Hampton who played for the Atlanta Falcons back in 1972. At the end of the season, they gave him the ball, he ran, and he got to 1,000 yards exactly. And they stopped the game. They gave him the game ball. He was the first Atlanta Falcon in the history of the franchise who had run for 1,000 yards. It was great. A few plays later, he got caught in the backfield and lost 6 yards. And they gave him the ball one other time in the game, and he gained one back, but he ended the season at 995. He's not a 1,000-yard runner. He got it a couple of years later, but there's a big difference between a guy who rushed for 995 yards and a guy who rushed for 1,000. It colors our view of running backs. And now, just to show that I'm an international kind of guy, let's talk about cricket. I don't know anything about cricket, but I do know about Sir Donald Bradman. Anybody here from Australia? Put your hand up. Now, do you know who Sir Donald Bradman is? He's the best, right? In cricket, the pinnacle of cricket are the international test matches where the Australian team will play the team from England, and it's like the World Series of cricket, and they keep special statistics for the number of runs you get in tests, they call them. Well, Sir Donald Bradman in 1948 went into his final test with an average of 101.39 runs per inning, or innings, I think they call it. And to show you how awesome that is, nobody else has ever, even to this day, has averaged over 60 runs per inning. So he was just great. But to go over 100, the century mark, was a very big deal. Well, his first time up, something bizarre happened, and he only got one run. And his average went down to 99.94. His teammates then actually did very well, ran out the match, and they won without Sir Donald ever getting another chance at it. And so he is known among cricket aficionados far and wide as the man who just fell short of averaging a century in his international tests over his career. He's maybe more famous for just barely missing it than if he had actually got it. But that number 100 really meant something. Now, some of you are serious runners out there. I have some children who are as big a fanatics about numbers as I am. And a few years ago, we were thinking about this with respect to running and marathons. So it turns out online you can get the finishing times for the New York City Marathon. And we got the data, 38 or 39,000 finishers in 2007. And we just looked, how many people finished just the 1 minute before the hour point? So they could say that my time was, for example, 4 hours, 59 minutes, and some odd seconds. And how many people finished just after that at 5 hours? Well, it's kind of interesting. If you finish at 4 hours, 59 minutes, and 52 seconds, and somebody said, well, what was your time in the marathon? What do you say? Oh, it's 4 hours and something. It starts with a 4. If you finish in 5 hours, 0 minutes, and 3 seconds, and say, what was your time? It was 5 hours. That's all they need to hear, 5, okay? There's a big difference. And for those of you who are statistics buffs, I did a binomial test on this to see if this difference between the number of people who finish in the minute before and the number of people who finish in the minute after, is that a statistically significant difference? Well, it kind of is. It's a very statistically significant difference. People, as they come up, and those of you who run marathons know that you don't have much juice left in the tank at that point. But when I see that clock and I say, if I just push it a little bit, I finish in 4 hours and something instead of 5 hours and something, people do that. The existence of these number thresholds, the fact that our actions are motivated by measurement, causes us to do things differently. We work harder. If you've ever had a sales quota in a job you've had, you know that you work harder to meet the number. And we see this in marathon data. All right, let's talk about personal finances. And you didn't know that you were actually going to get, at no extra charge this evening, the secret to financial security. So here it is. Spend less than you make. And I can't remember if it was a Saturday Night Live routine or a Monty Python, but somebody made a routine out of this. And I've been trying to figure out how to stretch this statement into a 300-page book so that I could sell that book for $24.95 and get financial security for myself. But this is the simple secret. That simple number. Here's what I make, here's what I spend, and this has got to be less. It's that simple. And my wife is here, Ramona, and I'm going to embarrass her a little bit. What's the most valuable asset that a new wife or husband can bring to marriage? And think about that for a second. I asked this to my Accounting 200 students last semester. One kid sitting over here, about where you're sitting right there, thought about it for a minute, and he said, a Lamborghini. So that's what he's looking for. He's dating women. He talks to them for a couple of minutes. Do you have a Lamborghini? No, okay, so he's gone. That's not it. Marry a person who has the simple belief that you can't spend more than you make. And you'll always be financially secure. Always. And if you marry somebody who doesn't have this simple belief, you'll always have troubles with money. When Ramona and I were first married, we got an apartment on West Center Street, on the south side of the street, just on the freeway off-ramp. It's such a great place that it's now been leveled and it's just a field. A field is just as good as the house that we lived in. We didn't have money for a car or for gas to put in a car or for insurance for a car, so we didn't have a car. We didn't know that, well, we could buy it on credit and maybe we didn't. No, we just knew we didn't have the money, so we didn't get one. We didn't have a phone because we didn't have enough money for a phone. We usually didn't turn the heat on in our little house in the winter. We just wore sweaters, and we would sit around. We had these sleeping bags that my mom gave me, and we just sit and read books, and it worked out fine because we knew we don't have enough money to buy all these luxuries. And our children have heard this story a million times, and they're sick of hearing it. But we've tried to teach them that if you don't have money for something, you don't get it. That's the simple secret to financial security. It's just this, it's measurement again. Now, I'll tell you what Alma said in just a second. Going back to this, another Accounting 200 student came just up to me just a couple of weeks ago and said, Professor Stice, a friend of mine and I were talking about this financial plan to get financial security, so let me describe it to you briefly. So he started describing it to me, and it was complicated. You do this and that and the other thing. And I told him, and so I'm going to tell you, the secret to financial security is so simple. You just compare those two numbers. What do you make? What do you spend? And the spend's got to be less. And so I told him, and so I'm telling you now. Any plan for financial security, any plan to get ahead, any plan to make extra money that is either complicated or seems clever is a bad idea. It's a bad idea. It's going to turn out wrong. You might get lucky for a while, but in the long run, anything that's clever, anything that seems complex is a bad idea. If it's more complicated than that right there, then it's a bad idea. Now, Alma's with me on this. Alma said, do not let us be slothful, not because of how complicated it is, but because it's how easy it is. We want complication. We want life to be complicated. Life is a series of one number in different settings. In this setting, the number is, what do you make? Spend less than that. It's that simple. And if you don't agree with me, talk to Alma about it because he agrees with me. Now, day-to-day personal goals. There's a key accounting principle. We teach this in our managerial accounting class. Remember, you get exactly what you measure. And let me give you my favorite example of this, the famous Soviet oil drilling contest. So back in the old Soviet Union, the oil drilling teams were put in competition because they didn't have a market economy. They had to think of other ways to motivate people. So the award-winning team never struck oil. Instead, what the award-winning team realized is this contest measures how many meters we drill. So you go up, you set up your gear, you drill down 100 meters, pull the drill bit up, move a short distance away, go down another 100 meters. You do that all day long. And the first 100 meters are pretty easy to drill, and you can do a lot of those 100-meter holes. Never even thought about reaching oil, and why not? Because they weren't being rewarded based on the oil that they reached or anything else. It was just the number of meters that they drilled down into the ground. So the question here, that is actually quite an interesting and sophisticated question, what would have been a better basis for evaluating the performance of drilling teams, is actually a very complicated question. I mean, do you want them to drill as far down as they can go and see if they can puncture down to the middle of the earth, or do you want to, is there some optimal level, and we'll want the team that drills the most 1,000-meter deep holes is the winner? The point is this: if you're running this contest, you've got to remember that people will give you exactly what you measure. So before you even start the contest, you have to say to yourself, what do we want these people to do? Is it best for them to drill shallow holes, holes 1,000 meters deep? You think about what you want them to do, and then you reward them based on that, because they'll do exactly what you reward. Well, I know this since I've taught this many times. I use this in my personal life. This is a very important point. Be careful what you measure. Measure the right things. We call, for businesses, a business that sets up their goals in a numerical setting, we call it a balanced scorecard. Well, I've got a personal balanced scorecard, and mine's right here. And I won't tell you all the things that are on my scorecard that I keep track of every day, but I'll tell you 5 from last year. My goals this year are a little different, but I'll tell you last year. I weigh myself every morning, and I just write it down. I just write it down. I'm at the age now where I like food a lot, and it's easy to gain weight. And if I just let it float, I know which direction it's going to float. It's just like your checking account. If you just kind of say, well, let's just see what happens, you know what's going to happen. It's going to go to 0 and then negative, and you're going to get a call. The same thing with my weight. If I say, let's see what happens, pretty soon I weigh 972 pounds, okay? I'm going for the world record or something. So I just weigh myself every day. And that simple measurement, I write it down. I've got it right here. I write it down every day. Like this, the cake is sitting there. I'm not going to eat that cake. Why? Because I know I'm going to weigh myself tomorrow morning. For me, I am convinced of the power of measurement, so I'm not going to eat that cake. I smelled it. But the chemical process doesn't add very much weight to you, so that's okay. Every day I write down, not how many pages I read, but what page I read when I finished in the Book of Mormon. Last year I had a fairly ambitious goal. My brother and I both challenged each other. We wanted to read the entire Book of Mormon every month last year, 12 times last year, so we did it. For those of you who can quickly do the math in your head, if you read the introductory pages, which there are 7 of, and then the Book of Mormon, which is 538 pages in total, 531 plus 7, that's about 18 pages a day. The first thing you do when you wake up, say, I got to get reading. Because if you wait until 11:30 at night and say, I got to get my 18 pages in, it's not going to happen. So that's the first thing I would do every morning. And the way I monitored it was, at the end of every day, I just write down what page did I get to. Well, we did it. Both my brother and I read the Book of Mormon every month last year. I can't do that every year. This year, I'm reading it every quarter, okay? Maybe when I get older, I'll read it every decade. I don't know. But it was a transforming experience. But the way I made it happen for myself is I measured myself every day. Where am I? Personal prayers. In Alma chapter 34, which we're going to look at in just a minute, we're told to pray morning, midday, and evening. I'm pretty good about morning and evening. Midday is tough. I mean, I'm in the business school, the lair of Satan. How are you supposed to pray in the lair of Satan? But I found that if I would just do a little tally mark at the end of every day, how many good prayers, not counting prayers on meals, did I do? I prayed more. And this is the one that maybe is a little bit embarrassing, but it works. I decided at the start of the year, I want to read a book with my daughter. I have 2 daughters who are 10 years old. I want to read a book with them every night. So the book that we ended the year with was Robinson Crusoe. And I put it on my little sheet. And I put a little check mark every night that I read with my daughters. And it would be 8:30 at night, 9 o'clock at night. Their mothers tell them to go to bed. And I think, well, they can't go to bed and go to sleep yet. I got to read to them. So there are times when I would go into the room and one of them would have already fallen asleep, but I kept the other one awake so that I could read to them, so that I could then pull out my thing and check off I read to my daughters. And am I a bad dad because I would then go from their room to my closet and get this out and put my little check mark? I'm kind of bad, but I'm kind of good, because I thought at the start of the year, I thought through very carefully, prayerfully, what things are important to me and what things do I want to make sure I do this year? Because I know if I measure it, I'll do it. So the good part of me set up the plan at the start of the year. The bad part of me read to my daughters just so I could mark it on my little sheet. But at least I was good when I set the goal, because I know about the power of measurement. We've talked about measurement in society, statistics. They're used to make us view things in a certain way because life is so complicated we can't understand the complexity. We can only understand a little bit. We're boundedly rational. And reporters and politicians and policymakers can impact how we view things by what numbers they choose to report. This happens in business. Sports is rife with numbers. Personal finances, and in our day-to-day personal goals. I suggest to you that you use the power, the motivating power of measurement, to make it so that you structure your life so that you do the things that you want to do and do the things that you don't want to do. Now, one more thing. A thought from Alma's friend, Amulek. This is from Alma chapter 34. This, by the way, when I was first invited to give this address, the very first thought that came into my mind that second when I saw the invitation were these 2 verses. So I want to make sure that I tell you about this. This doesn't directly tie to what I've been talking about, but this is very important to me. Cry unto him over the crops of your fields, that you may prosper in them. Cry over the flocks of your fields, that they may increase. Well, I don't have crops or fields or flocks, but I have a career. And is it okay for me to pray about my career, to ask for Heavenly Father's help for my flocks, my fields, and my crops? Well, it turns out it is. I asked a colleague of mine, Ted Christensen, an accounting professor, to write up an experience that he had that I'll bet some of you in this room have had similar experiences. He came to BYU about 10 years ago as an assistant professor, and he was worried about the publish or perish notion. And he writes that I knew that if I didn't publish some of my research in a high-quality journal, I would not be tenured at BYU. He had 5 little boys when he moved here. His little daughter was born on the morning of his first day teaching at BYU. He had a family to be worried about. And he didn't have the research pipeline, the working papers to get things published, and so he was concerned. He made it a matter of prayer. And here's what he writes. In the summer of 2001, I attended the annual meeting of the American Accounting Association in Atlanta, Georgia. Let me stop here to say that you haven't lived until you've attended the annual meeting of the American Accounting Association. It's about 3,000 accounting professors in one place. I mean, there's no more rip-roaring time in the whole country. It's in Washington, D.C. this year, first week in August, so if you want to be there, talk to me. Back to Ted's story. One afternoon after a big lunch, I attended a session in which several research papers were presented. Since it was right after lunch, I was a little tired and was having a hard time staying awake. Some of you know about this. During the middle of the session, one of the participants in the session stood up and made a comment to one of the presenters. His comment kicked off a vigorous discussion about pro forma earnings. To that point, I had never even heard of pro forma earnings. He didn't even know what they were talking about. But just like Enos in the Book of Mormon, a voice came in to his mind and said, "Wake up. You need to listen carefully to what they are discussing." So he roused himself, took notes about this pro forma earnings, and by the end of that hour-and-a-half session, he had some ideas for a research agenda. And he came back to BYU, and he realized that he was going to need to hand-gather a whole bunch of data, and he was going to need students, so he applied for a student mentoring grant. And so he got a team of students. And after a few months, they had the largest pro forma earnings database in the whole world. And they started to generate working papers and then publish papers. And the master students that he was working with were getting published papers in top journals and then starting PhD programs. He writes that he has now had from that little inspiration to go back and work on this thing, pro forma earnings, whatever that is. We have now published 7 studies in top academic journals. They are all directly or indirectly related to this original idea that came through inspiration on a sleepy afternoon in Atlanta in 2001. Now, does the Lord care about pro forma earnings? Trust me, he does not. Does the Lord care about Ted Christensen and his family? He does. He hears prayers over our flocks and our fields. Even if our flocks and fields are academic research papers or a professional career or getting that job or getting that internship. I have had the same experience that Ted has had in big issues and small. Should I take my family from the beautiful campus of Rice University and go to Hong Kong to a new university? I wasn't left alone to make that decision. This paper that was just rejected by a top journal, what should I do with it? Is it okay to pray about that? Yeah, it is okay to pray about that. And my experience and testimony is that Heavenly Father hears those kind of prayers. Now, I'm not suggesting that you say, okay, great, stop work. Don't study anymore, just pray. Fast and pray, and that's how to get things done. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you do your work, but please don't be so prideful that you think you can do it all on your own. And also, don't think that God won't hear your concerns, great or small. Whatever your flocks or fields are, pray over them, and you'll receive answers. I have. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.